Welcome. I'm taking this time today to speak about the astrological cycles for world dynamics. So, we will explore the geopolitics, power struggles existing, opportunities, and basically the new world that is now in its birthing process, birthing pains. Astrologically, we are in this really unique time when three slow-moving planets are shifting at the same time on cardinal degrees. This does not happen often, if at all, in recent history. It's big enough that one of them does. So when three of them, Jupiter at zero Cancer, Saturn at zero Aries, Neptune at zero Aries as well, synchronized together, we expect a new world order, really. Now, when we explore these dynamics, we will look at the charts of leaders, we will look at the chart of countries, and generally speaking, try to understand what the intentions are. From an evolutionary point of view, which is my approach to astrology, we always understand the universe is an intelligent design. And that means that every activation, every influence of planets has an intention, but it doesn't always mean that on a human level, we align with these intentions. Sometimes we have to learn the hard way, unfortunately, and unfortunately, more often than not. However, if we use astrology as a tool for self-knowledge and for general understanding, we can avoid the worst case scenarios. So when I unpack these dynamics, I will speak about what the intentions are and what is the risk if things are not properly handled. It's all part of that package. So having these three planets moving into cardinal degrees is super important. But if we speak about Neptune, particularly in Aries, it is also the midpoint between Uranus moving into Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius. So everything is centralized through Neptune in Aries, basically. It holds that 0 degree cardinal Aries for a longer time. It's the midpoint of Pluto Uranus, and it also serve as the anchoring point for Saturn and Jupiter, which will also cross those degrees, but faster. So understanding the meaning and the intention of Neptune in Aries is probably most critical if, to kind of piece all the puzzle together. So what is it? I will recommend that you watch this workshop I presented on the transits of Neptune in each signs, going from 1928, when it moved into Virgo after the Great Depression, until now, 2025, and its whole stay in Aries until 2039. So this will give you a very deep overview of the way Neptune works. It's just $40 and it's a 4-hour session, really peeling the layers and giving you tools to understand how to face these next 14 years as it spends time in Aries. But we're going to touch on it right here. So wherever Neptune goes, it challenges the dynamics of power because Neptune has to do with public service. It has to do with the collective oneness. It represents our spiritual identity. Now, when we speak about geopolitics, what does that have to do with spirituality? Spirituality is part of our lives. It's part of our survival, whether we are in tune with it or not. And what Neptune does, whatever archetype it's in, this in Aries now, it is going to distribute that power to the whole so that everyone can find their Aries sovereignty. So one of the things that will happen when Neptune moves into Aries is movements of independence, movements of revolution, and a need for autonomy. It may not start that way because it's a 14-year process. So we're going to see different stages. We talked about birthing pains, but we will definitely see a world being redrawn, boundaries, countries reshaped, because as Neptune moves into Aries, you will have the emergence of nations, populations, ethnicities demanding sovereignty and autonomy. We speak about Greenland separating from Denmark, right? They just had elections recently. And looking at the chart, as a Pisces entity living, in the Arctic by the ocean and becoming such a strategic land in the geopolitical power play between China, Russia, the United States, all the Arctic routes are opening up due to the melting of ice. And of course, it's mineral rich, a lot of resources there. And so this whole um, reconfiguration of what's happening with Greenland is very symbolic, with Trump aiming, to include it as part of the United States. And the question will be with Neptune in Aries, is it done by force or is it done, through a democratic process? Trump, is used to executive orders. He doesn't take no for answers. So even though he tries to do it in a pacifying way, we'll see how that evolves. However, looking at the charts of Greenland, it does look like through that Neptune in Aries movement with Saturn coming along, that Greenland is going to become an independent entity, and then it can form alliances, with other countries, other nations, other groups. Now, because Greenland is, gained its first autonomy during Jupiter in Leo, and Denmark is also a Jupiter in Leo state, we can anticipate that this change of status, whether it's full independence or whether it's a new kind of deal between Denmark and Greenland, will occur during the upcoming Jupiter in Leo cycle, which begins July 2026. So about a year from the time this video is being made, something's going to happen with Greenland. And again, it's very symbolic because it represents a movement that is happening across the world where nations, populations will want to find their own identities, will want to find their home with Jupiter in Cancer. We obviously look at the Palestinian cause and what is happening in the Middle East and the different scenarios that are being played out after the deep trauma happening between Gaza and the Israelis. And on the one hand, so much destruction, but on the other hand, never before was the Palestinian cause gripping, the whole world's attention. And we see people around the world galvanizing to support an independent state for the Palestinian. What form and shape is debate is part of the debate. Trump has very exotic ideas about what he wants to do in Gaza, in speaking also about possibly displacing the Palestinian to Africa. That's the latest. So I'm going to talk about that in the course of this video, but my point is that this is part of the trend. The Palestinian people are not going to go back to what it was. Israel is made it very clear that it doesn't want to go back to the status quo either. It has its own version of what it wants, and the idea of transferring Palestinians to somewhere else, whether it's other Arab countries or African countries. It's kind of the wet dream of Netanyahu. But all Jews around the world know the value of land, know the value of the motherland. With Jupiter in Cancer, the ancestral connection to the motherland is not something you can just play with. So there's an emotional connection to where you belong. And so these fantasies about creating, a Palestinian state, all kinds of random places in the world, doesn't look very realistic, and very disrespectful. But what we can see from an astrological point of view is that the need for sovereignty is very important for everyone. So I'm going to unpack the Palestinian Israeli conflict and look a little bit into the hostage situation and how to reestablish balance in this very old conflict. Something I wrote about in the article and video on Saturn, Neptune. I invite you to check this on my website. It's a really, I think, important piece. Looking at Saturn, Neptune into Aries, these separatist movements are going to increase across the globe. And it begins, we mentioned Greenland, we mentioned the Palestinians. It will be a lot of indigenous people also claiming their sovereignty. It's a 14-year cycle. It will happen gradually, but I suspect this will also happen in the United States, where not only the African American civil rights movement, has gained traction over the years, but I believe the Native Americans will also be claiming their own sovereignty, their own need to be recognized in some ways. Now, if we speak about the previous time that Neptune was in Aries, I expand on that in the course of this video. This was the time of the Civil War. This was the time of the Civil War in the United States. And that meant that this was the time of liberation for for African American, at least the first stage of their liberation, where they could become citizens and certainly not, work for nothing. So this liberation movements can happen through conflict, through a war. And the circumstances for that are incredible, because you will see how the United States enter war on very specific chronological, astrological references. And this is one of them. As we speak about indigenous cultures, we speak about Native Americans. It can also, show up in Australia and New Zealand. So this movement across the globe may gain more traction. And it's interesting that at the same time, as all the planets, Neptune moving into Aries, Uranus in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius, are all moving from water, earth, which are feminine signs, into air, fire, which are masculine signs. So water, earth have been, the previous cycle we've been in, um, not only in the past decade, but these slow-moving planets have met in the 60s, in Virgo and Scorpio. Neptune was in Scorpio, Pluto and Uranus were in Virgo. And then they met in 1998 when Pluto was in Scorpio, Neptune, Uranus were in Capricorn. So all earth, water repetition. So now it's the first time when they actually meet in air and fire, all three together. And so it changes the script. What happened during the previous cycle in earth, water was that there was a contraction. Feminine signs contract, so it brings self-doubt, it deconstructs, it works on, internal security. So this was the dismantling of colonial influence. In the 1960s is when the African country gained their independence, because colonialism, was not a good thing anymore. And in the 90s is also, up to 2025 is also how human rights, the need for scrutiny and redistributing power, empowering more vulnerable populations was part of this. So the water and earth signs are going to be more self-critical. They're going to want to rectify the wrong things that were done. They want to rectify the economy if it's wasteful. They want to rectify, abuse of power if there was any. So all these years from the 70s into the 90s into the 2020s were all about breaking things down, shrinking, smaller countries, um, tightening the economy to make it more efficient. And now, as they move into fire and air, there is this booming energy again, this need for expansionism again. And we hear, Trump speaking about expanding the United States and Greenland and Panama and Canada and Gaza. And so suddenly there is this energy going out again, expansionism, creativity, and it goes beyond the terrestrial boundaries. This is a time where the expansionism will also um, manifest through space travel. And I believe, this is a time where we may also scientifically recognize extraterrestrial forms of life, whether it's on exoplanets or whether it's, very primitive water organisms. It looks like this is happening next. It's part of that expansionism and contact. That's one of my talk, Uranus in Gemini, is called Contact. And so what we're dealing with here is a time of immense creativity. It's a time of hope and faith. because everything is possible again and we engage in an adventure. But always when you have these expansion cycles, there's usually a bill to pay later on. There's usually some kind of going overboard, pushing boundaries too far, abusing power again. And so it's going to be very important for humanity to, on the one hand, seize the opportunity. The sign of the time, calls for experimenting, expanding, whether it's artistic, whether it's industrial, whether it's, again, space travel. But the risk of megalomania, excesses, waste is tremendous. It has already happened before. And so, creating more bubbles that will eventually have to burst, which is always the case with Neptune, Jupiter. So Neptune is in Aries, Jupiter is going to be in Cancer. You have this expansion, no boundaries, everything is possible. Let's hope and have faith. And then there's a popping of the balloon and it creates a contraction. This is happening this June and July already. More to unpack. Now, as we speak about independence movements, sovereignty, we speak about, Taiwan and China as well, and many other conflicts that I have no idea about just yet that will emerge over time. Um, we can look for where the heat is on now, but we don't know what will happen 3, 4, 5 years down the road. This is still in effect until at least 2028. So another thing to pay attention to as we speak about Saturn, Neptune conjunct at 0 degrees, go back to my article. If we speak about movements of separation, it may also affect the homogeny and the unity of the United States. Depending on how things evolve and unfold in the coming year or so, we may start to see more and more call for independence, not just between indigenous and white, but also from state to state. Because what happens with Saturn, Neptune is not only the need for independence and autonomy, but it is also the feeling that whoever is in power, whatever was solid, whatever was taken for granted, whatever was the rock that we could rely on is eroding. So Saturn is the rock, and Neptune comes along and erodes the rock just like water erodes rocks. And so whatever we thought was indestructible, whatever we thought was always the model, can crumble. The last time in 1989, this cycle affected the dismantling of the whole Soviet Union into many different small countries. It was also the end of apartheid. This ruthless regime eventually collapsed in the early 90s, and with the freedom of Nelson Mandela, who became, the first Black president. So there's a deconstruction, there's a dissolution, and sometimes it's not just the bad guys like the apartheid. It can simply be that a regime, is needing to move to a new phase, and it's a test of resilience, it's a test of integrity. So what will happen to the United States as Trump is shaking the foundation so profoundly and so quickly, including alliances with different partners in the world, the European, the Chinese, the Russian, and South America, and the neighbors, Canada, and Mexico, and neighbors are Gemini. Uranus is in Gemini, so Gemini can build bridges, and Uranus can also destroy bridges. Trump is born with Uranus in Gemini. So is he going to destroy those bridges? Maybe, maybe not. We are in the thick of the process. What is happening, though, is if there is that kind of shakeup, and we see this Aries movement needing sovereignty, needing to reclaim individual power, it will be very critical to observe whether more independence movement on a state level will occur. There were initially some movement from Texas, the Lone Star state, um, claiming, the need to become its own country. Um, Maybe California, you know, depending on what happens at Washington. But the bottom line is that suddenly the United States, that was seemingly, a strong, resilient, reliable force, is losing its credibility. It's disintegrating, where Europeans now have openly voiced that they don't trust the United States. Even, whatever happens with Trump, there's something that is broken. Even if they manage to patch things up, if they manage to find a way to um, get over the tariff wars and whatnot, there's something in the trust that was shaken, that suddenly alliances don't mean as much, and they could be broken if my business, if you don't have the cards, or if my business move are not um, practically supporting our alliance, the ability to burn these bridges very quickly has shaken Canada, Mexico, Europe, to the point where the United States is isolating, and it's losing its respect, its prestige. The paternal or maternal empire that governed the world, suddenly, it's imposing so many harsh rules, and disregarding alliances beyond commercial and power play, that can lead to the fragmentation of its status. We also see now more, there's been movement to decentralize the dollar, to find new references for currencies and for the economy, which the dollar was always, the central point. Will that remain the same? With Saturn, Neptune, everything erodes. And so if then it was the Soviet Union, what will happen now with the United States? And what will happen now with the Russian entity? We know from that article that I wrote, and other astrologers are very familiar with the cycle. André Barbeau spoke about the reference of Saturn-Neptune cycle with the Russian entity, and how, the Bolshevik Revolution, um, Stalin, birth and death, were all related to Saturn-Neptune cycles. A lot to unpack, and exciting times, daunting times. So let's dive into it. I have shown this graphic of these cardinal energies, where we see all the, big powers, China having a sun in Libra, the United States having a sun in Cancer, Russia having a sun in Capricorn, and Iran having a sun in Aries. And so, these are very important entities that control, resources in the world, and not only resources, but ideologies. And they are all on this cardinal axis, which will be activated by the Saturn, Neptune, Jupiter interplay in the early cardinal signs. So we can see how everyone is affected. And it's, is it a coincidence that this superpower each hold a different, um, a different angle of this cardinal cross? And not only that, there's another version to this, but we can also replace Iran with NATO, because NATO is Aries as well. And so NATO represents most of Europe, and it's at 14 Aries, the United States 13 Cancer, Russia 3 Capricorn, and 7 Libra Sun for China. Now look at the Mars, because Mars has to do with defense, with sovereignty. And you see that the Mars of the United States is also opposing the Mars of Russia, which happens to align with the Mars of Putin, which is also at 26 Sagittarius. And then NATO with a Mars in Aries, and China with a Mars Pluto in Leo. We're going to look at these charts, but you understand that as Saturn and Neptune move into those signs, it will reshuffle, the power, uh, the power dynamics of these countries, and maybe reverse some of the, structure of power, to see, new development. So another very interesting alignment, um, all of these major leader key players in current world dynamics have very similar Mars at very similar degrees. So Trump's Mars is on his ascendant at 26 Leo. Um, Suleiman from Saudi Arabia is at 23 Leo, Bibi Netanyahu at 26 Leo, and Putin has Mars at 26 Sagittarius, but his Pluto is at 22 Leo. And then Zelensky's Mars is earlier Leo, but he has Saturn there, conjunct NATO's Saturn, on those Mars degrees. So interesting that Zelensky wants to join NATO and Putin is against NATO. Trump is very, showing a cold shoulder to NATO. And so you see their Mars is on the Saturn of NATO, and, the contentious energy here. And you can also explore, the contentious energy and the creative energy that exists between these leaders. Obviously, Mars in Leo is very strong among leaders in general, because it's a very, it has to do with sovereignty, it has to do with courage, it has to do with, also, standing up for yourself and being bold. And so when you see, for example, Trump's Mars on his ascendant, anyone who thought he was going to be a pacifier is obviously not understanding astrology. But you see how the dance that he is having with Netanyahu, then on the one hand, there is this Mars alliance of testosterone and, they're kind of the bodies, the boys club, it's very Mars and Leo, boys club. And, they are meeting in Washington and deciding to evacuate, all the Palestinians from Gaza and build a Riviera, the Trump Riviera in Gaza. And so you see this kind of bromance with this Mars. But then you also see that this can get contentious. When you have Mars aspects, um, it works until it doesn't. As long as you have goals and as long as you have a common enemy, a villain out there, that Mars can really bond and can really create strong alliances. But as soon as there are cracks, it becomes having, two big egos in the same room, so to speak. And they start to rub against each other and they start to rebel against each other. And it becomes, it creates sparks and fires. So you see this dance among these leaders where there's on the one hand, this kind of commitment and wanting to fight, the bad guys, whoever takes the role of the bad guy in turn. And then friction. So it's going to be very important to track those degrees and what happens with the current astrological cycles. Another very important graphic to see here is that we also have within the US administration and the key players very contentious Mars energy. In the previous video, I covered how all, 90% of Trump's nominees have a Mars-Sun aspect, either conjunction, square, opposition. And now we see also that they have their Mars align, we can say, with and against each other. So Trump's Mars at 26 Leo, Elon Musk's Mars at 21 Aquarius, Vance's Mars at 22 Scorpio, and Steve Witkoff, who is the negotiator for the Middle East, the US negotiator for the Middle East, has his Mars at 28 Taurus. And interestingly, the current negotiator, Adam Bowler, I think his name is, who bypassed the Israelis and went straight to negotiate between the US and Hamas, has his Mars at 28 Taurus as well. So you have all these leaders with Mars late Leo and late Sag, and you have all these US key players with Mars at late fixed signs. So it begs to check when, and what is going to happen around those degrees. So we look at what planets are going to be hovering over late fixed signs. And of course, Uranus is going to be one of them. Uranus is now at 24 Taurus, and it's going to move into Gemini in July. So between March and July, Uranus is going to trigger all these Martian people through a square or an opposition, etc. And then at the same time, Mars by transit is going to move into Leo, and it's going to be at those late degrees Leo, between, the 1st and the 18th of June. Happy birthday, Trump. So Trump is going to have a Mars return, and it's going to shoot, the opposition to Musk and square to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff and J.D. Vance. Then later, Mars is going to be in Scorpio, do the same. So every time Mars is going to be in the late degrees of fixed signs, it will create this chain reaction, and we can expect massive development, ruptures, disagreement, volatile energy. But the intensity will also peak actually next year, end of 2026 and 27. And I'm looking into the next 5 years because these trends you know, are building up, so to speak. So end of 2026 and into 2027, I spoke in the previous video of how Mars will retrograde at the end of Leo. And so it's going to make 3 passes, one retrograde and third. So we're going to have a lot of that. All these people are going to be ironed with those Mars energies. And so will the internal leadership of the United States. So we can expect some of them to say, I'm out of here. We can expect divorces of some sort. Or, once again, Mars can also, bring people together, have them bond if there is an enemy. We can see the exact time also where both Mars and Uranus will be at those late degrees fixed signs, and that's going to be June 15, where Mars is 28 Leo and Uranus is 28 Taurus. Now, I also added, the Saturn Neptune coming very close together in Aries. And this is something we all need to pay attention to, is because this conjunction is so central, it's such an important commanding force of the next few years. Because it's in Aries, we have to look at where Mars is. Mars is the ambassador. It's the ruler of Aries. So because these two will be in Aries for such an important phase, tracking Mars will give us information of what is happening with the Neptune, Saturn activations, what countries affected, what's happening with the economy and so forth. Talk about the economy, right? Currently, Venus is retrograde, the stock market is in shambles, and we see here with Mars Uranus this strong effort to try to, reconstruct, boost, create, bring new incentives and energy into markets. But it also represents, the erosion of the alliances that existed between the United States and other countries. So it's hard to know where it's going to go, more contentious tariff wars, or whether it is going to create new deals and new incentives that will boost the economy, because Uranus ultimately wants to elevate, increase, accelerate. Now, keep in mind, this is all happening right on these people's charts. One note about Elon Musk, if you know his chart, you look at it here. He has currently Saturn opposing his Pluto on the nodes, and this is going to be going very strong into the month of April. And Saturn brings accountability, scrutiny, um, testing his results. And so whatever he's doing through his personal businesses or through his political involvement is going to be highly scrutinized. And there's a big risk with Saturn opposing Pluto to expose his own corruption as he is busy exploring, what is corrupt out there. It may backlash, it may turn against him. And also, it shows the fragility of his businesses, the fact that his stocks are disintegrating, and the fact that his health, may take a blow. So not an easy time to take on his task. But Saturn is always fair. Saturn gives you rewards when you're in integrity, and Saturn is, the karmic boomerang if you're not. So we'll see what happens there. Just a flashback on we talked about the economy and we talked about the tariffs. Um, it's interesting that the two neighboring countries of the United States are led by initially Justin Trudeau and Claudia Sheinbaum. And those two countries, were basically targeted by Trump's tariffs. And this basically freezes the economy for everybody, for them, for the United States. But astrologically, it's so interesting to see that both Justin Trudeau is born with Venus on the North Node in Aquarius, and Claudia is born with Venus in Leo on the North Node. So they both have Venus on the North Node in opposite signs, and Venus represents the economy. Now, when is Trump suddenly coming up with his tariff threats? When Venus in the sky in February was on the North Node. So this kind of repeating signature of Venus North Node that creates this tariff intensity economic battleground. What is also interesting is that Justin and Claudia have exactly opposite suns, and they have exactly opposite Mercuries. Mercury has to do with neighbors, has to do with trade. And so you see how they are on each side of the United States, sandwiching with their Venus, with their Mercury, and with their Sun. Now, Trudeau is out of the picture, and the new leader here is Mark Carney. And I'm showing here the chart from my Facebook group called Evolutionary Skies. So he is currently serving as the Prime Minister of Canada, replacing Trudeau, and this all happened as the North Node was on his sun. So he's a very heavy, mutable energy person, but he, is invested in, protecting the sovereignty of Canada, obviously, since we talked about it. And so, yeah, I invite you to visit this page. It's called Evolutionary Skies. And there's a lot of discussions and great astrological interactions. NATO and how NATO, which represents the military alliance of European countries with the United States, to build some kind of resistance. Back in the days, it was formed in 1949 with the Cold War. And so we know that NATO plays a central role in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Putin, feeling threatened that that Ukraine wants to join NATO. and will, have NATO bases on its territory, threatening modern Russia. So, you know, part of the loss of Putin is that since he initiated that war, he actually strengthened NATO, with Sweden joining, with Finland joining. And so instead of really, you know, calming things down, he uh, boosted the defense. Now, when we speak about an alliance, we speak about Aquarius. Aquarius has to do with the group, like my group. Where do what group do I belong to? Uranus as well as Aquarius. And so that is in general, what we look at in astrology. But obviously, if NATO is Aries, it has to do with defense, it has to do with weapons, it has to do with standing up to the Soviet bloc. And here you look at the chart of NATO and you see the sun is in Aries, right? And it's conjunct Mars and Venus. So we see that this alliance was created during a Venus-Mars cycle in Aries and opposing Neptune in Libra. Neptune is the pacifying quality. Mars is the readiness to fight. And both Mars and Venus rule the nodes of NATO in Libra, Aries. So this whole concept of having a strong defense in order to not just create an alliance, but to keep the peace is important. But now Saturn and Neptune are coming to this axis. If we look again at the Uranus, I said, alliances are usually an Aquarian thing, and we look at Uranus, the ruler. So the moon is conjunct Uranus in Gemini. So it's an alliance of neighbors. Neighbors is Gemini, neighboring countries. Moon has to do with, each country's identity and how this kind of Gemini brotherhood community brings, Europe together in this line of defense. Now, look at how amazing astrology is. We spoke about how the Ukraine, really wants to join this alliance. Will it ever? One of Putin's conditions is that Ukraine does not ever join NATO, at least not in the foreseeable future. And yet Ukraine needs some kind of guarantee that it's not going to be, bullied by Russia over and over again. Now, you remember, the infamous meeting between Zelensky and Trump at the White House and how this shouting match led to, contentious energy and a rupture. Now, if we look at the composite chart, so what is a composite chart? It merges the two charts of the individual to see what their relationship is about. We see that they have Mars in Leo on the North Node conjunct Saturn. So these two don't really like each other. Mars energy has a lot to do with competition and with each side feeling like they need to protect their territory. But it's interesting to see that, wait a minute, their composite sun is exactly the same sun as NATO. So Trump Zelensky equals NATO. Go figure. What does that mean? Will that eventually lead the Ukraine to be part of NATO? It seems surreal because Trump is not in it. is not interested at this point, and said it's completely unrealistic for the Ukraine to join NATO. But it also means that their discussion, that their relationship is surrounding NATO themes, whether it's how NATO supports Zelensky and how Trump reacts to that. So, it's NATO that unites them in one way or another. But wait, let's look at this now. Putin's sun is exactly opposite NATO's sun. How graphic can that get? So NATO is basically an alliance to prevent Russia from spilling over, from taking over. And it happens to be that the suns are exactly opposite. And no wonder that Putin feels threatened by any kind of ex-Soviet country to now become, part of NATO. It goes against the initial, Great Russia scheme. Now we remember that back in the Soviet times, when the Soviet, under Stalin, invaded the Ukraine, they confiscated all the farming equipment. And that caused, confiscated land, collectivized everything. And that caused a great famine in the Ukraine. So when people say, well, the United States is fighting a proxy war through Ukraine, you know, to destabilize Russia, I think there's some truth to that. But we have to remember that Ukraine has a very ancient history with Russia. And the fact that that they were subjected to a famine where people were so destitute that so many people died, but they also resorted to cannibalism and really horrific story in 1932 and 33. So what we're basically seeing here in this whole need to separate from Russia and to have their own sovereignty and protection is not only current modern politics of, who's trying to play who. There is a lot of grief. There is some kind of ethnic cleansing memory that Stalin destroyed Ukraine. And we can, of course, know that Ukrainians will never want to go back to that and will never trust Putin. So looking at Zelensky, what is going on in his chart? Talking about alliances, Zelensky is born with a Sun-Venus conjunct in Aquarius. So no wonder he wants to join an alliance, right? Aquarius is the group. What is the group? It's obviously NATO in this case. Now, remember NATO's chart. Where is the moon in NATO's chart? It's 22 Gemini. And so you have here NATO's moon Uranus. If we go back to this chart, NATO moon Uranus on Zelensky's ascendant and Jupiter. So, the forces are really leaning towards him joining at some point. Now, what are the astrological cycle coming up? A few things are happening most immediate, there's an eclipse at 9 degrees Aries happening end of March, and it's on his south node. It's in Aries. Now, eclipses are game changers. We're in the thick of it now. Everything happens very fast. Decisions are made that can have lasting consequences during eclipses. So it's a time of reshuffling. It's a time of destiny, of higher intervention. So when the eclipse is on his node, it is a moment of destiny. Because it's in Aries, it has to do with personal agency and sovereignty. So we can expect Zelensky to stand up for, to stand his ground and to stand up for himself and for Ukraine. And hopefully, reach a fair agreement if peace is in the cards. At the end of April, we have the last Mars-Pluto opposition. And mind you, Zelensky is born with a Mars retrograde in Leo. So he had that pass of Pluto, Mars on his own axis for several times in this winter. The last pass will be April 26th, which will be very decisive. So the end of April could lead to a breakdown or a breakthrough. Now, the next step, in this month is that he's going to also have a Jupiter return in Gemini. So there's an eclipse in March, there's a Mars-Pluto opposition in April, and then there's a Jupiter return in May. And the Jupiter return may indeed bring an agreement. Another thing to mention, we talked about NATO's moon being on that Jupiter ascendant, but Trump, Sun, is 22 Gemini, also here. So after this contentious meeting that happened, late February, perhaps they will get along and they will strike a deal around May, early May to early June. There are good prospects for some kind of agreement, some kind of positive negotiation that may serve the cause. So fingers crossed for, a fair deal. Looking at the other side of the equation, Putin is actually going through a very rough time. And we may think, well, Trump is warm to Putin, so he should feel elevated that finally he's getting out of his isolation. But if we look at the transits and we look at what's happening astrologically, Putin is not so happy. He feels very deflated. Saturn and the nodes are squaring his Mars. So Mars, right, is his, is his impulse to defend himself, to conquer new ground, to basically do what he wants. Mars represents your willpower. And since in Sagittarius, and so Putin has a voice and he is ambitious and he wants to expand his territory. Sagittarius is about expansion. But Saturn and the nodes are squaring that Mars all through April. Now, when Saturn is on the nodes, it's a time of karmic boomerang. So once, what I said, you can reap the reward of your hard work, or you have the bill coming and you have to pay your debts. So this Mars-Saturn feels more like a castration, more like a feeling that he's fiery Mars has to now comply, bend down, surrender. So it's not happy at all. His Mars in 26 Sagittarius opposes Zelensky's Jupiter and ascendant at 27 Gemini. They have a very interesting synastry. Putin's Sun and Saturn are on Zelensky's Pluto. So no wonder he sees him as this, underworld daddy who wants to eat him up, Sun, Saturn on his Pluto. But then Mars opposing, on the descendant, which is known enemies, opposing his Jupiter, trying to silence him. Now, if you look at Putin, he's born under a Saturn-Neptune cycle himself in 1952. So the current Saturn-Neptune is a recurrence of his own natal signature. You also see this little thing, AXA. It's a dwarf planet called Ixion. Check my video on Ixion in my YouTube channel. Ixion has to do with insolence. He was a leader who betrayed Zeus, betrayed Jupiter, to betray the gods, and was, given a second chance, and he blew his second chance. I won't get into the whole mythology, just watch the video. It's an introduction to Ixion. And so Putin's Sun on Ixion shows how the renegade, the fact that he is not part of the club, that he doesn't want to be perhaps part of the club, but it creates this daunting, edgy and possibly corrupt entity. Now, so Putin, is not having a healthy time. It could also affect his personal health, not just power games and power dynamics on the global scene, but very, personal issues with his health, liver, immunity, kidneys, is not doing so well. The other thing that's happening, we say Saturn and Neptune are meeting in Aries. It's not affecting his Libra planet just yet. But soon enough, Saturn, within a year or two, will start to oppose his Sun, oppose his own Saturn, oppose his Neptune. It's in the sixth house, if we trust this chart, because it's a speculative chart. I think it works as far as the day of the, October 7, 1952. But we're not very sure about the time, if it's a correct time. If it is, it is in his sixth house, and it will have to do with health, healing diseases. It will also have to do with employment in his country. Now, we know that the economic sanctions that were imposed on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine are starting to really affect Russia very deeply, and weaken it, because it doesn't have the industry, it doesn't have the equipment that it relies on to stay a strong military power. So there's a lot of talk that Russia is on the verge of really suffering a big blow because of the economic sanction. Over time, it had eroded its stance and its power to continue the war. And so if there is an agreement, it will come at the best time for Putin, because he needs to replenish. He needs to get supplies that have been, hasn't been accessible to him. But, no easy years for Putin and a possible collapse that may come, sometime either when Saturn is opposing his sun or when Neptune will oppose his sun. Saturn will oppose his sun in 2026, 2027. These will be pivotal years anyway in Putin's regime. If he survives it, there will be another round of Neptune reaching those degrees, not right away. It's going to take 7 years to get there. So more so around the 2030. But already, Putin is weakened considerably. Looking at, our big players here, we mentioned Neptune in Aries being the midpoint and a grand sextile between Uranus and Pluto. All in air and fire signs. Now, how that affects the United States. The United States has its IC at 1 degrees Aries. So that's where the Neptune-Saturn conjunction is going to happen. On the IC, which is the point of stability. The IC is where the people are. It's where we feel safe. It's the home. So it's in Aries, land of the free, home of the brave. That whole slogan of freedom is very central to the Aries IC of the United States. So with Neptune moving on that degree, it destabilizes that confidence, that sense of security. Like we say, it brings a feeling of a quicksand. Uranus will be in Gemini. So the United States is experiencing its third Uranus return. Let's go back in time. The previous time Neptune was at 0 Aries and Uranus was in Gemini. Wait, that was the Civil War. Uranus at 9 Gemini, Neptune right on the verge of moving into Aries, exactly where it was, exactly where it is now, 2956 Pisces. That's when the Civil War started. So that Neptune on the cardinal degree hits the United States IC and hits the United States Uranus return, because Uranus and Neptune are synchronized in their cycle. 2 Neptune cycles, 2 Uranus cycles equal 1 Neptune cycle. And wait, what happened with the next Uranus cycle? That was another war. D-Day. Oh my God, I'm trying to move here this stuff to show the chart. So the following Uranus return was the Allied invading Normandy in 1944 to fight the Nazis. So every time Uranus returns, the United States is at war. And Neptune, the first time, was at 1 degrees Aries. The second time at 1 degree Libra. So right on the IC, MC, of the Sibley chart. Now, why? What does that have to do with Uranus and Neptune? Keep in mind what we said earlier on. This is a time where there's a need for liberation. Neptune in Aries speaks about a need to reverse the power dynamics so that individual countries, individual people reclaim their individuality, their sovereignty, their defense. With Uranus in Gemini, it's a need to change alliances. Who are you going to be an ally with? And who are you going to liberate? So the Civil War was about liberating African American who were enslaved. So that was one. And the second war was liberation of Europe and the liberation, from tyranny. The very concept of the United States to free ourselves from tyranny is an Aries concept. So the tyranny of 1860 was slavery. The tyranny of 1944 was Nazi Germany. Who is the tyrant in the upcoming Uranus return? Neptune on this angle. Let's look at some charts. This is August 2025. Uranus, Saturn are very close together. They're not conjunct yet, but it's half a degree. It's pretty much there. So they're going to be working together for sure. Then you have the Pluto and the Uranus. Excuse me, Neptune, Saturn, and then Pluto and Uranus forming this grand sextile, which will stay for quite a while together, right? We mentioned this grand sextile is from 2025 to 2028. So here in August, everything happens. It's on. And it's a time of great creativity. It's a time of brand new slates, of redefining borders. But Mars is opposing. So as these three come together, there are going to be a lot of shifts, new planets triggering them, moving away. And we mentioned that we need to pay attention to Mars because Mars rules these planets in Aries. So when Mars is opposing Saturn, it is explosive. We see again Uranus in Gemini, an alliance. Mars opposing Saturn, a crumbling regime. Pluto in Aquarius. Again, who's with whom? Who's allied with whom? What kind of group are you part of? And then what kind of technology are you using in your battle? We're moving into an age where AI is now a major factor in conducting conflict, where wars are conducted through power grids and internet supply. How do you weaken a country, right? You go under the ocean and you cut cables. Energy supply has to do with Neptune in Aries. cyber wars, technological wars, drone wars are connected with Aquarius and Uranus. So this is contentious. You know, August is going to be a very, very intense month globally. We go back to our, big chart here, all cardinal signs, everyone's affected. How far it goes, I don't know. But all this lands into the United States MCIC. So Uranus, Neptune, Saturn on the IC, and Mars at the top, and Uranus approaching its return. So August is shaky. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean an armed conflict, but it does mean tremendous tension, internal division, and possibly, ideological, political conflicts. In our own lives, it is a time where we need to be choosing our battles. It is a time where we may want to separate from anything, any system, any affiliation, any relationship that we feel doesn't, is not what it was. If we feel that it's eroding, if we feel that it is not as strong as it used to be, and not as reliable as it used to be. So things that were once strong are now cracking. And Mars comes in the opposition to give it, another blow. Later, Mars conjuncts Saturn, Neptune, and Mercury. Look at this 7-degree Aries conjunction. And this is, again, wherever Mars is, we need to track Mars. So whenever Mars is in those early cardinal degrees, it's flammable, it's defensive. It could lead to, tantrums. But like we said, something is being birthed. Now, I mentioned some states, some populations may want their independence. So all these Mars energy joining the Saturn Neptune can galvanize, separatist movements, all kinds of populations that want their own sovereignty. And it can lead to basically, like we said, proclamations of independence. We'll see where, how, who. Now, I want to look at this chart and for just one moment. So we see here this chart with this important conjunction in Aries, and then we compare it to the United States NRA, National Rifle Association. So this is an association that lobbies for the right, the Second Amendment right for each citizen of the United States to be able to own guns and fight tyranny, fighting tyranny, Aries. So this organization was founded when Neptune was in Aries, just a cycle of, 160-ish years ago. And it's typical to Aries because Neptune in Aries has to do with people being able to defend themselves. So it captures the theme of, individual sovereignty, able to maintain and to defend themselves against any kind of oppression or any kind of bullying power. But this all comes in at these 7 degrees. It will square the NRA's own Saturn, Mars in 7 Capricorn. So Saturn, Mars at 7 Aries, whereas Saturn, Mars at 7 Capricorn. This will lead to some kind of restructuring of the NRA, possibly a change of leadership, but very likely an important turning point with the organization and with the Second Amendment. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, in July 2026, Jupiter joins the dance. Initially, we had Neptune as the midpoint between Uranus and Pluto, and they're here in July, all at 4 degrees fixed signs. Saturn has moved along, it's a little further out, but Jupiter joins at 4 degrees Leo. And so we have this extended sextile in the fire air signs. And Jupiter in Leo, has a lot to do with creativity. So we can really anticipate very bold moves. I talked about this in the 2025 USA video, where this can lead to possibly, re-galvanizing the economy, and production, and likely also the expansionism. Now, if we speak politically and economically, Jupiter in Leo also has to do with gold. We know that there's a lot of speculation about how we have the gold as a reserve, solid value for any kind of currency, and how there's an attempt to use Bitcoin as a digital currency that can also, or even replace gold, or at least be a substitute, or be added as a supply to gold. So we see here Pluto in Aquarius representing the cyber decentralized currency, and Jupiter in Leo representing gold. What will happen in this opposition? My bet is that that's when this dynamic will be played out, and whether Bitcoin, will become what Trump's wanted to be, or whether gold will remain in the reference. Now, we are at a time where Saturn Neptune changes references. So gold was always a gold standard. It was always, the Saturn rock. It was the material mineral and metal that we could always fall back on. But now with Saturn Neptune, nothing is what it seemed. Things that used to be strong lose their relevance. Will this affect gold? I don't know. You tell me. On another front, speaking about the Middle East, Iran is Aries. Iran is on the spot. First of all, it's very fragile at the moment, but it is also specifically, affected by these transits astrologically. So you have 2 leaders, the supreme spiritual leader, Ali Khamenei, and the president, who is second in line in power, Masoud Pezeshkian. Now, if we look at the charts of Iran, the current Mars solar eclipse in Aries is going to be very close to Iran's sun. The equinox chart is something also we need to talk about. And the Saturn nodes that I was talking about is going to affect Iran. So let's look at that. This is the solar eclipse of March 29, 2025. So you see Iran's sun is 11 Aries and the eclipse is at 9 Aries. The nodes and Saturn are approaching Iran's Mars. Iran itself is born with Saturn on the nodes. So there's kind of an opposition of that Saturn node dynamic. Now, this in itself speaks about internal conflict, but also about deep defense and resistance. So we know that Trump, is pushing Iran to dismantle its nuclear arsenal. And we know that they don't want to. How far will this go? Will this destabilize the regime? Will there be a military conflict? It doesn't look very stable because another chart that comes into play here is the equinox chart. So when astrologers want to do predictions for the year, one of the charts they use is the zero Aries chart. Every year around March 20, when the sun is 000, we cast a chart and we look at where everything is. If we cast that chart for Tehran, Mars is exactly on the ascendant in Cancer. So it's contentious, it's defensive. Mars in Cancer is about, protecting the homeland. It doesn't look very stable. Now, we know that over time, Neptune has been hovering over all these Pisces planets in Iran, and that led to a lot of protests. There were a lot of incidents about women being brutalized by the modesty police, leading to uprising and more killing. And so Iran has been already fragilized by its own internal dynamics with Neptune on its Mars in the past few years. So now as Saturn comes in, and as Neptune and Saturn moves on the sun of Iran, it may collapse. I'm just saying it I don't know again when, how much, but it doesn't look like this is going to hold. When we look at other Middle East dynamic, we look at this particular individual, Bibi Netanyahu, leader of Israel. And he's going through the Saturn Neptune possibly affecting his ascendant. Now, again, with these leaders, we don't know if we have the exact time of birth. These are speculated chart. And so it may or may not be exact. But he has a total lunar eclipse on natal Saturn. I'm going to explain why that's important. And because he's a heavy Libra, like Putin, all these Aries planets will oppose his Libra planets as well. So let's look at that. His Saturn is at 15 Virgo. Now, each time something triggers his Saturn, he's in trouble because he's not a Saturnian guy. He cheats, he lies, he manipulates. It goes against the integrity of Saturn. So Saturn is this constant need to realign, to bring back people into integrity and to hold them accountable. So he's been constantly avoiding accountability for internal dynamics, his own corruption scandals, his own bullying of, the Israeli people, and of course, the aggressive campaign against Palestinian. So when Neptune initially was opposing his Saturn a few years ago, that's when he was busted and all his defense collapsed and he had to stand trial for corruption charges. Then when Saturn was opposing his Saturn in Pisces, that's when the war against Palestinian happened, and he was charged through the International Court of Justice for crimes against humanity. Now, he doesn't take it too seriously, but it annoys him. And the final push in January of Saturn at 15 Pisces opposing his Saturn is when the latest hostage deal was signed and agreed upon. And it led to some kind of de-escalation of the hostilities, which is extremely fragile and flammable again. So this Saturn is a key factor in whatever happens with his sovereignty, with his leadership, and his need for accountability, our need to make him accountable. Now, Saturn passed, Neptune passed, but there's going to be a lunar eclipse exactly 15 degrees on his natal Saturn. That's going to be in September. Now, mind you, these eclipse degrees are vibrating ahead of time. So with this lunar eclipse happening on his Saturn, and like I said, maybe if his ascendant is correct, then Saturn and Neptune are also squaring his ascendant. And then Mars is in Libra on his stellium. Chiron is opposing his sun. He's in a very, very precarious place. That can lead, to destabilizing his position and to some kind of collapse. It can also lead to a health crisis because it's in Virgo, the eclipse is in Virgo Pisces, which has to do with health. It could also have to do with, signing a deal. If things go well, let's say that if there is a level of integrity still remaining in a positive sense for him, could be also a time for foreign relation development, deal with the Saudis and other important milestone. But Saturn brings accountability in one way or another. So it looks very shaky. And if we speak about the Saturn Neptune eroding the rocks, and Bibi has been in power pretty much since 1996 in Israel, on and off. He won in 1996, which was a Saturn in Aries year. And then he was so bad that he had to leave politics, but he made a comeback. and then hasn't left since. He keeps winning elections after election. So it's an important cycle for him, and I will expand on this at some point. As far as the hostages are concerned, there's a lot of negotiation right now. There's a lot of sabotage and a lot of uncertainty whether there is going to be a continuation of the phase 2 and phase 3 of the ceasefire agreement with Hamas. And so I believe there is hope on the more immediate term around April 7, when Saturn and Venus come together again. There could be a milestone in advancing the release of prisoners and hostages. But again, it's hard to be absolutely certain because the times are so volatile. And yet, if there is a window of opportunity, that's one of them in the near future. Now, I spoke about, this whole Aries planets bringing a need for independence and sovereignty, and whoever is oppressed wants to claim their independence. And so obviously the Palestinian cause comes into mind. And it's interesting historically that who was then the leader of the Palestinian organization, Arafat, declared the independence of Palestine in 1988. And it was mostly symbolic. Some countries recognized it, most didn't. And of course, there's no physical establishment of land. But it became some kind of a anchoring point for the independence movement of the Palestinian. And what is very interesting is that, if we compare this chart to Israel's chart, it's opposite suns. So Israel's chart is 23 Taurus, and this one is 22 Scorpio. But it was at a time of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1988. Not only Saturn-Neptune, but Saturn-Uranus. So now this Saturn-Neptune is squaring the Mars of the time, which shows this, fight, 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 and, call for liberation, call for independence, Mars in Aries. We also see the nodes in Virgo Pisces. Guess where the nodes are now? In Virgo Pisces. Where is the eclipse going to happen in September? 15 Virgo Pisces. So right now, Neptune, Saturn move on that Mars, square the natal Saturn, Neptune, along, excuse me, with the nodal return and an eclipse coming. So we may see phase 2 of this independence movement gaining traction. How far will they go? It's a momentum that astrologically exists. If they get organized and if they are able to stand up for themselves. What is really happening also, we have to understand that as Trump is very much dividing the world, taking sides and then pushing others away, his whole Gaza plan leads a lot of the Arab nations on the one hand, to feel disempowered, but on the other hand, it also can bring them together as a resistance to the United States sovereignty because they feel singled out, they feel unheard, they feel that they are not represented. And so all this Aries movement is not going to take authority, supreme authority that they do not trust. And so when Trump, laid out his plan to rebuild Gaza without the Palestinians, he keeps saying, no, no, we're not going to chase them away. He said many things, and he's doing exactly what he wants. There are negotiations now to find a place for Palestinians in Africa. They're talking with Sudan, right? That's the latest. So it's interesting that it echoes the history of the Jews, because back when the Jews were fighting for their own independence and they were, fleeing oppression in Europe, the pogroms in Russia and North Africa, there was some kind of a fantasy that the Jews could have a country of their own in Uganda. So they wanted to create an Israel in Uganda. And here, the same thing repeats, interestingly, where they want to now bring the Palestinian to Sudan, which is very close to Uganda and South Sudan. How bizarre, and how history just repeats itself because leaders don't learn and they make the same mistakes over and over again. So to make my point, as this plan to depopulate Gaza and rebuild it is completely unrealistic, it only will build resentment, Aries, defense, resistance. And so we can expect, and that's my speculation, that many of these nations who feel unseen, who feel singled out, who feel unwelcome, will bond together to create their own kind of a counter PowerPoint, including Turkey. And Saudi Arabia is kind of on the fence. So who knows what will happen? But as far as the independence of the Palestinians, it seems like this coming second half of 2025 is going to see a possible return to address the issue. Now, when it could, such a country eventually be birthed, it could happen anytime that Neptune and Saturn is in Aries, or when Saturn and Uranus meet again, and that's going to be 2032. 2032 is a Uranus-Saturn conjunction at 29 Gemini opposing this one. So that could be a milestone as far as, establishing a new state. Going east, another place of intensity and contentious energy between China and Taiwan. So Xi Jinping is leading China, communist China, and claiming sovereignty over Taiwan. The Taiwanese do not recognize China as their leader and want to preserve their independence. So it sounds familiar, right? Now, she is also born under a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, just like Putin. So he's going to have a recurrence of that. But look at the two leaders. They're both Mars-Sun conjunctions. One late Gemini Cancer, the other one Libra. And they're both interacting with Mars-Saturn tight aspects. So Lai Ching-te, who is leading Taiwan since last year, 2024, has his Mars on Xi's Saturn, and his Saturn opposing Xi's Mars. That is not, it is not friendly. That shows demonstration of military force. So Taiwan needs the United States support. Will it get it? You know, where is Trump going to stand in these power dynamics, especially since they are both cardinal degrees? So we can expect as Saturn and Neptune now are in Aries, 0 Aries, going to square Xi's Mars. It's going to square Lai Ching-te's Saturn. And then later on, his Sun Mars. So there could be, again, tension and a need for sovereignty and a need to establish themselves permanently as a separate entity. So we understand with Saturn, Neptune being in Aries, that countries will not want to be dominated by the big entities. In the contrary, independence movement are likely to gain more traction. Whether it's Taiwan, whether it's the Palestinians, whether it's, you know, the Greenlanders. At the same time, Pluto in Aquarius does speak about alliances. So once the Aries sovereignty is recognized, there could be treaties, you know, cooperation, and you know, the world that we all want to live in, a world where people have a roof on their head and they can grow their own food on their own land and can have their independence to be who they're meant to be, but at the same time have friends, Aquarius, have allies. So we need to hold that vision because it's not happening very easily. I invite you again to check my Facebook page where a lot of these discussions are ongoing, a lot of astrology cycles and humor and serious conversations. Of course, if you want to understand better the Saturn-Neptune influence and Neptune moving into Aries, check the Neptune book. It's a very popular book, and of course, I'm very proud of it. And of course, if you would like to take astrology studies more deeply, understand these cycles, not just on a mundane level, but on a personal level, take astrology seriously. You understand how accurate it is, how reliable it is. In a time where everything falls apart, astrology remains a burning flame, and it will only grow stronger because it's the truth. Peace in the world. May all these changes happen in an organic and benevolent way. I know it sounds very idealistic, but we have to aim for that. We have to aim for the best. Be safe, everyone, and we'll